Welcome back, AP Psych. Hope you're all doing well out there. Today we are moving on in Unit 7. We've covered so far all the parts and pieces of memory, encoding, storage, retrieval. Now we're going to move on to somewhat of a different topic of how our memory can be a little bit fallible and we can forget, and how memory construction impacts the way that we think and pull up different memories and what those memories actually include and if they're true or false. So before we get started, I'd like to say hello to Archie over here. How you doing, bud? Hey, buddy. And we'll move on to our memory construction topic. So, forgetting. It's our inability to retrieve information due to poor encoding, storage, or retrieval. So we can forget, or things can go wrong at any stage of the memory process. And I always love this. It makes me think of Harry Potter, especially Neville, when he gets that very forgetful, right? He gets that remember all, and it lights up red when he forgets something, but he can never remember what he's forgotten. So memory can happen at any stage, encoding, storage, or retrieval, and it's our inability to get that information up. Encoding failure is when we cannot remember what we did not encode. Okay, so this is important, right? This is especially important for school and just in general, your lives. If you're not paying attention or entering the information into our memory in the first place, we're never going to be able to retrieve it because it doesn't exist, right? So you can't just think that being present for something, being alive in a situation is going to cause you to remember it. No, we need to actually put effort into encoding that information and storing it in our memory. So if you're just watching this video and thinking, oh, I watched it, I'll remember it. If you're not actively taking notes, actively writing things down, if you're just watching the video and answering the questions, it's not really going to be there when you try to pull it up later on, right? So you have to actually be paying attention when you're doing these things. Also, so that's encoding failure. Over time, if we do store information, it can decay, right? Poor durability of stored memories leads to their decay, yet not total deletion. So we will have partial memories left over of these memories that have slowly disappeared. We talked about this in class a little bit with Ebbinghaus and his forgetting curve. He showed this with his forgetting curve. The initial drop in the retention of info, right? We'll look at it again here in a second, but it evens out over time. So it drops off precipitously over the first couple days and then kind of evens out as you go. We believe this is due to the gradual fading of the memory trace in the brain. So we talked about that engram concept and the idea of long-term potentiations and your neurons making stronger connections. Well, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So that memory starts to fade because it hasn't been connected very strongly within your brain. And the connections aren't as strong and as efficient as they once were. So that memory starts to dissipate somewhat. That's storage decay. So similar to Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, Barrick showed a pattern similar to that with forgetting and retention of Spanish vocabulary over 50 years. So instead of days, this is over years. And you can see, again, like if you learned Spanish in high school and you became fluent in it, but then you didn't use it anymore over the first 1 to 3 years, boom, you're going to lose over half of that information, right? But then they found that it kind of levels off and stays relatively consistent over the next 50. So it shows that storage decay does occur, but it doesn't lead to complete deletion of that information and of that memory. Just a lot of it tends to disappear, disconnect. Then we have retrieval failure. So we talked about encoding failure, storage decay. Now we're at retrieval. We have retrieval failure. And although the information is retained in our memory, it cannot be accessed for some reason. You can't quite pull it up. You don't have the right retrieval cues that are providing you the information to pull up what you need. We talked about tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's retrieval failure. And you know it's there. You can bring up the information, or you can think of the information. You just can't fully bring it out of storage to get it out and use it. So like when we did some activities in class with the 50 states and things like that, a lot of you experience tip of the tongue phenomenon because you're like, oh, I know what it is. I just can't quite get there, right? That's your retrieval failure. You need better retrieval cues to pull that information up. Okay, so let's talk about a few things that can get in the way of our learning and retrieving information. So learning some information may disrupt retrieval of other information. So this is a little bit of a part of a retrieval failure. So we have two types of interference, and we'll get an acronym in class to help you remember this. Okay? So proactive interference is when old information interferes with remembering new information. So you've learned something new, and then you try to retrieve it, and you come up with the old information that's getting in the way. You can't overcome that. So for example, your cell phone was stolen, and you had to get a new phone and a new number. But whenever someone asks for your new number, you still give out your old one, right? That old information is getting in the way of the new. That's proactive interference. It's retrieval failure there. On the other side, we have retroactive interference, where this is learning of new information interferes with the recall of old. So new information is masking older information that you want to retrieve. Okay, so let's say you're currently in calculus class. You're trying to help your younger sibling with geometry, and you were really good at geometry, but you can't remember how to solve that geometric equation because calculus is getting in the way, and all you can think about, all that's in your brain actively right now is calculus, and you just can't quite get to the geometry information that you know how to do, right? That's retroactive interference. New information gets in the way of old. So those are two types of interference. Like I said, we will get an acronym in class to help you remember those two very easily. So just a little tidbit on retroactive interference. Sleep helps avoid retroactive interference, leading to better recall. So study before you go to bed for a test in the morning, right? Without interfering events, recall is better, which makes sense, right? If you don't want any new information to get in the way of old information that you've learned, then just take in that information and go to sleep, because that means there's not going to be any new information, and your brain's going to be able to consolidate all that memory and make the connection stronger, right? So you won't have any new events getting in the way of your studying because you went to sleep directly after. So before sleep is a great time to study, and you can see the difference here. These people and how much they remembered of what they were supposed to learn, right? Their recall was much, much better compared to those who remained awake after studying. All right, so there's other reasons why we forget. And we can go back to our friend Sigmund Freud here and some of his theories. And he came up with things like, I think about Sigmund Freud, he's all about the unconscious mind, right? So he talked about motivated forgetting and how people can unknowingly revise their memories. We don't want to remember items we don't want to remember. Excuse me, let me say that again. We don't remember items we don't want to remember. So that's Freud coming back to his love of the unconscious and how our mind can manipulate our memories, and we can kind of push them away or forget about them if we don't want to remember them, which kind of makes sense. People who experience traumatic things, those things can be erased from your memory. It's almost like your mind protecting itself. And this kind of connects directly to repression, which is a defense mechanism that banishes anxiety arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories from your conscious mind. Okay? Repression is very similar to motivated forgetting. We push these things down that we don't want to remember, or we repress them because we know that they cause anxiety or they cause us stress. And there were a time in our life that maybe we don't want to recall. So that's another type of forgetting called motivated forgetting. So here's some more information on why we forget. Forgetting can occur at any stage of memory. Like we talked about encoding failure, storage decay, and retrieval issues, like we mentioned. So we filter, alter, or lose much information during all of these stages. And you can see that here in this graph, or this chart, I should say. When we have our sensory memory, we have tons and tons and tons of pieces of information coming in that we need to filter out. We only give so many of those pieces of information significance. So only so many of them transfer to our short term, right? And from there, we only rehearse and give more meaning and encode a certain number of those things, which make it to our long-term storage, okay? And sometimes in long-term storage, items are altered or lost over time. So when we try to retrieve that long-term memory, depending on interference, the retrieval cues we're receiving, our moods and our motivations, some things get retrieved and some don't. So by the time we've gone through all these stages of parts and pieces of memory, encoding and storage and retrieval, there's only little bits left. So you have to focus on those things you really think are important to get them all the way to long-term memory. And know what retrieval cues you're going to use to be able to pull them up. And some memory loss is due to factors other than just forgetting. So moving past this, why we forget, there is some memory loss due to structural damage to the brain. And that is most likely amnesia, or partial or complete loss of memory. Okay, so this is another reason as to why we forget. So you have causes, some physical damage to some part of the brain, like Alzheimer's disease, stroke, brain trauma. Some of you experienced concussions out there, I'm sure, and maybe you had short-term memory loss, or you've had memory effects from things like concussions. There are also psychological amnesia, and this can be triggered by some type of traumatic event, right? We just talked about Freud's motivated forgetting. Maybe that's part of this, right? And most memories will return over time, usually within a few days. However, these traumatic events can cause short-term or even long-term amnesia. There's a couple types of amnesia we want to talk about. So you have anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. Now, hopefully in class, the acronym that we will give you for interference will allow you to keep the two separate. Okay, so proactive interference and retroactive interference are not the same things as amnesia. With interference, it's a recall failure, right? Retrieval failure. In amnesia, completely forgetting these things. Okay, so anterograde amnesia is your inability to remember ongoing events after the incidents of trauma. Anterograde, A for antero, A for after. So after the incident, you don't remember the things, the onset of the disease that caused the amnesia or the head trauma or whatever. This always makes you think of 50 First Dates, when Adam Sandler's trying to date Drew Barrymore, but she has anterograde amnesia. She doesn't form any new memories. So it's like a new date every day with her, right? He's reintroducing himself every day. On the other hand, you have retrograde amnesia. When you think retro, think old school, think back, think before, right? It's our inability to remember events that occurred before the incident of trauma or the onset of that disease that caused the amnesia. Okay, so retro, you can't remember anything before the event. This always makes me think of Men in Black, when they show up and they flash your memory and you don't remember anything of what you saw before they took your memory away, right? Retrograde amnesia. So those are another two types of terms in terms of why we forget. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here and move to memory construction. So we just talked about forgetting and the aspects of forgetting. Now we'll talk about memory construction and why our memories may not be as perfect as we think, or our memories, have some false or misleading information within them. So while tapping our memories, we can filter or fill in missing pieces of information to make our recall more coherent or complete. I want you to think about Gestalt psychology and all those principles we talked about with, closure and similarity and things like that, and how our brain fills in missing pieces because it likes whole pictures. It does the same thing with our memory. When we have problems with retrieval or we have storage decay and pieces are missing, our brain fills it in. And so there are some issues with our memory construction and our memories that we might not realize. First, misinformation effect. This is when we incorporate misleading information into one's memory of an event. Okay? Like we said, this is not done to be deceitful by our brain. It just likes nice, complete pictures. So it fills in the gap, right? Think back to Gestalt, like we said. So parts and pieces of our memory are being filled in by our brain, things that weren't actually there or didn't actually happen, because it wants to have that full picture and make things seem nice and neat and clean. One of those aspects of misinformation effect is source amnesia. And this is when we attribute an event to the wrong source than we have experienced, heard, or imagined, right? Misattribution. This happens all the time, right? You're talking to a friend and you're saying, oh yeah, I heard, this is true, right? You're like, oh, well, where did you get that piece of information? And you say, oh, I saw it on the news, or, I read it in an article, when in reality, it was from your crazy uncle on Facebook or something like that, right? This is a big issue today. People misattribute the source of information they got, and they say they got it from a trustworthy source, but they really didn't. So they forget where it came from. And that's how misinformation can spread Um, and sources can be incorrect, and information can seem legitimate when it's really not, because we forget the source of information that we've gotten that piece of info from. So one of the names you want to highlight star here is Elizabeth Loftus, and she's a psychologist who's done a lot of study into memory construction and the misinformation effect. She's conducted so much research in this arena. One of her most famous studies about misinformation effect is she got a group of college students to sign up for a study, and she contacted their parents and obtained a list of childhood events and big events in their childhood, things that they would remember, things that would be kind of like milestones. And she asked the students to recall those events. However, to those events, she added lists of plausible things that occurred while those events were taking place, things that like never happened, right? So to those major events in their childhood, she added things like getting lost in a shopping mall, spilling a punch bowl at a wedding, or meeting Bugs Bunny at Disney World, which is funny because Bugs Bunny's not a Disney character, so he would never be at Disney World, right? So she's kind of trying to implant these memories that never occurred. After repeated recall attempts over a period of several days, many of the students started to claim to remember these bogus events. And all that was required were some credible suggestions. Okay, so people started producing vivid memories of these things occurring when in fact they never did, right? And that's the misinformation effect. All it takes is some suggestion, some plausible pieces of information to completely manipulate people's memories, which is really interesting and has some serious implications for everyday life. That leads to the idea of, okay, what is true versus false memories that we have? So just like true perception and illusion, real memories, or memories that seem real, are difficult to discern for us, right? So just because a memory feels real doesn't mean it is real. Those college students came up with vivid details of what happened when they got lost in the mall or when they spilled the punch bowl, and how people felt about them and how they felt. And it became very emotional memories that never occurred. Now, we can't really tell the difference between those, but our brain can tell the difference between real and false memories. Why? Well, remember, encoding. If you weren't paying attention, or if you never experienced something, there's no trace of that memory in your brain. So when you try to remember that time that you got lost in the mall, and you're like, yeah, it happened. I was so afraid. I went up to these people trying to find my mom, and you're making all this stuff up. Your temporal lobe in your brain would not be lighting up. The brain scan would say, there's no memory here. This is a false memory. Unfortunately for all of us, we can't take a brain scan every time we're trying to determine if one of our memories is real or not. But if something was never heard, there would be no sensory record to be activated in the temporal lobe, right? So our brain activates when we remember things that did actually happen to us. So that is one way to determine if a memory is false. So if the brain was analyzed when you were told about how you heard the false fact, the temporal lobe would not be activated. Interesting. What does this tell us about eyewitness testimony? So you have to think about the misinformation effect, true versus false memories, storage decay, retrieval failure, all these things. And if we can really believe that eyewitness testimony is accurate. It's a great question. You can ponder that for a second. We're going to do more about this in class and see the impact of eyewitness testimony in the legal system and how truly reliable or unreliable it is. Often, eyewitness testimony is full of errors, but it is still one of the main methods used to gain information about crimes, which it has to be, right? If people were there and they saw it, they need that information. But there are some important things to remember about eyewitness testimony. People's recollections are less influenced by leading questions if they're forewarned that the questions could create memory bias. So if people are being made aware of the fact that I'm going to ask you these questions, I don't want it to impact your memory, it may, they're less likely to be impacted. They've been primed to make sure that these questions don't impact their memory. However, if they're not, and police or interrogators start to ask these leading questions, it can impact their memory, and they can create misinformation effect or false memories that they never had or experienced. Passage of time also allows original memories to fade. So if you want accurate information, You need to ask those eyewitnesses immediately and not let time pass so that storage decay does not occur. Also, things to consider: the age of the witness matters. Younger children and adults over 65 may be especially susceptible to the influence of misinformation. Right? So all of these things are very key to getting correct and as accurate as possible eyewitness testimony. So we've talked about this a bunch, right? But how can we improve memory? And I know it seems a little bit repetitive, but that's kind of the point when we talk about memory techniques, right? We want to study repeatedly to boost long-term recall. When you think about how this class is structured, we have notes, we have vocab, you have access to reading guides, you have access to review guides, and we do things in class all over the same concepts, right? If you did all of those things, that's hitting every concept at least 5 times, right? That's me using these techniques to try to get things to stick for you. Spend more time rehearsing or actively thinking about the material. Okay. Vocab, right? When I have you make examples, trying to make examples from your life, that's actively thinking about the material. Or at the end of the notes, when I have the summary section, when you have to summarize in your own words what we just went over, that's the same idea. You're actively thinking about the material in a different way and you're rehearsing it. Okay. Make things personally meaningful. How do we do that? I always tell you with vocab, make it connect to your life. When you can make it connect to your life, it's going to last and store in your memory much longer, and you're going to make a much stronger connection that is resistant to storage decay. And I know you're like, so much as we do all this all the time. There's a reason behind everything. You know, I said, trust the process. This is the process of memory, and it works. Use mnemonic devices. We do this in class. We talked about peg words in some earlier notes and method of loci and how they connect and make things easier to remember. Maybe you got to experience that with our memory activities. Make up a story like the link method. If you think back to the memory champions we watched and how they do things, they make up stories with method of loci and they combine all these memory techniques. Chunk things out. Why do we space out our activities? Why do we chunk out vocabulary? Because it works. Acronyms. We use so many acronyms in class. We'll get another acronym for the different types of interference, right? But sodas, bats drink blood, the one coming up, right? We talk about all these things to help you remember important aspects of class. Other things to think about. Activate retrieval cues. Okay, so mentally recreate the situation and mood in which you encoded this information, right? If you're doing this at a desk, hopefully you're doing it at some type of desk. So when you're asked to retrieve this information, it'll be much easier. Or if you're chewing gum while you take notes, chew gum in class or chew gum during the test, right? That's not cheating. It's just a helpful memory technique that can actually activate retrieval for you. Or think about my voice. I'm the one who's teaching you this, right? If you think about my voice and the way it sounds, it might pull up that information. Be in the same mood, the same physical state. All of those things can be very beneficial for your memory retrieval. Okay. Recall events while they're fresh before you encounter misinformation. Back to the notes. The summarizing, this helps with that. But also that question at the end where I say, do you have any questions about this topic? When you come into class the next day, ask right away while that question's fresh, while you need clarification, so that it doesn't go away or you don't encounter things, misinformation and get confused, right? Ask as soon as you can so that you can get that information corrected. Okay? Minimize interference. Test your own knowledge. When we review, that's why I put practice tests up. That's why I put AP Classroom questions up. The best way to know what you know is to test yourself. And the best way to get better at testing yourself is to test yourself. Okay? Rehearse and determine what you do not yet know. Okay? When we talk about the questions on these video notes, if you're missing questions and you're struggling, that helps you determine what you don't know yet and what you need to go back over. When you're studying and you're going over the review guides, same thing. Determining what you do not yet know is massive in terms of improving your memory. Okay, we call that metacognition. Thinking about the way you're thinking and processing information, doing that alone improves your memory. And it says it's a great first step to say, I don't really know much about this, Let me find out about that. Or I can't really remember what the difference between true and false memories are. Let me go back and look at that. And that in itself is a great memory technique. Okay? So all of these things can help improve your memory and can help you avoid things like misinformation effect, true versus false memories, interference, uh, and encoding failure, storage decay, and retrieval failure. Right? So this wraps up our memory forgetting and memory construction notes. If you have any questions, please let me know as soon as you can, and I will see you in class.